This is a 5-minute presentation on work that examines if humans have a finite pool of worry, and that also examines if humans have a finite pool of attention to climate change, specifically when faced with new threats such as COVID-19. So, we know that COVID-19 has been increasing in prevalence since it began in 2019 and became more prevalent in 2020. This begs the question of what the effect of increased threat of COVID-19 is on climate change attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. So in this study, we look at two specific psychological variables related to climate change, climate worry, and attention to climate change. And we try to decipher which possible effects of COVID-19 prevalence we can find evidence for. So there are a few different possible effects. We might see that as COVID-19 increases, nothing happens to climate change worry or attention. But some past research suggests that we may see a crowding out effect, and this has been called a finite pool of worry effect. In the current paper, we extend this idea to also test a hypothesis called the finite pool of attention. It's also possible that as COVID risk and COVID worries increase, we may see that there is an increase in worry about and attention to climate change. And this can be thought of as a kind of generalization effect. So in order to examine our two hypotheses, one regarding a finite pool of attention, the other regarding a finite pool of worry, we collected a lot of data from 3 different countries, focusing on 2 main cities in each country. We collected our data longitudinally, starting in December 2019, continuing through July 2020. So we have before and after the COVID became a major threat in our data set. We collected longitudinally about 20,000 survey responses, and we also monitored news and social media data in our target geographies. So let's take a look at some of our results. First, I'll show you estimated regression coefficients that identify the association between local COVID-19 cases and these self-reported outcome variables that you can see on the y-axis. First, to give us some context, let's take a look at the association between local COVID cases and outcome variables here related to the economy. We see strong positive associations between COVID prevalence and worry about economic problems, as well as attention to economic problems. So we operationalize attention as self-reported discussions and thoughts about some threat. Regarding climate change, we see a different pattern of results. We do see evidence for a finite pool of attention effect, which we can see in these negative associations between COVID cases locally and self-reported climate discussions and climate thoughts. But we don't see evidence for a finite pool of worry effect. In fact, we see some evidence in the opposite direction, which may suggest a kind of affect generalization effect at play. I just note that in these regression analyses, we do control for demographics, a time-fixed effect, and geographic fixed effects. We also looked at an even stronger specification of this finite pool of worry hypothesis, an even stronger specification to test it, which is looking at within-person changes in worry about COVID-19 and within-person changes in worry about climate change. So we had some participants that took our survey twice, and this allows us to do this within subjects analysis. So what we see is that people who increased in COVID worry over time also increased in climate worry over time, and vice versa. We wanted to replicate this effect with a new sample, so we collected a different repeated measures sample, this time focused on the US population, and we found essentially the same pattern of results. Again, not showing evidence for a finite pool of worry effect, and showing some evidence instead for a affect generalization effect. So turning now to our news and social media data, what we see is that as COVID-19 news attention increases, which we can see on the x-axis, news attention to climate change decreases. So again, we see a crowding out of attention to climate change, which is similar to what we saw in the survey data that I showed you on our first graph that I presented to you. With our Twitter data, we see essentially the same thing across these 3 countries. As attention to COVID-19 increased on Twitter, attention to climate change decreased. And each data point here that you see in both of these represents a weekly proportion of tweets about climate change out of all tweets, and news articles that mention climate change out of all news articles. And these are both z-scored on both axes. So to sum up, we see across multiple data sets at multiple levels of analysis and across several continents evidence for a finite pool of attention, but we did not see evidence for a finite pool of worry. Instead, we find some evidence that worries may generalize, such as when people hear about COVID-19, think about COVID-19, and start to feel worry, instead of that crowding out worry about climate change, when they then turn their attention to climate change, they feel as or more worried than they would have otherwise. Thank you very much.